Some stories begin with laughter, and some of them end with a room so quiet you can hear a ceiling fan turn. This one happened in a small county in southern Missouri, where a young woman was laughed at for putting chickens behind her cows. At first, everybody thought it was just another strange college idea, something that sounded good in a classroom, but would fall apart the first time it met mud, heat, coyotes, and real cattle. Then fly season started, and by the end of that summer, the men who had laughed the loudest were no longer looking at the flies on the cows, they were looking down at the ground. The first laugh came before the flies did. It happened on a Thursday morning in May of 2022, inside Bradley Livestock Supply on the edge of Bolivar, Missouri. The store smelled like mineral blocks, leather gloves, sweet feed, diesel dust, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. 3 men stood near the counter, talking about hay prices. One local cattleman was flipping through a flyer for fly tags. Behind the register, Tom Bradley was cutting open a cardboard box with a pocket knife he had carried for 20 years. Then Rachel Turner walked in. She was 24 years old, wearing muddy boots, faded jeans, and a University of Missouri sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up. She did not look like trouble. She looked like a farmer's daughter who had come in for supplies. But what she put on the counter made Tom stop cutting tape. A roll of electric poultry netting, a bag of chick starter, a box of poultry water nipples, a pack of gate handles, and 2 small replacement wheels, the kind you might put on a garden cart. Tom looked at the pile, then looked at Rachel. "You starting a chicken business now?" he asked. Rachel gave him a small smile. Sort of. One of the men by the coffee pot turned around. Tom leaned one elbow on the counter. Sort of. Rachel took out her wallet and said, "I'm putting chickens behind the cows." For 1 second, nobody said anything. Then Tom Bradley laughed. It was not a mean laugh at first. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he hears something so strange he thinks the joke has already been told. But then the men by the coffee pot laughed too. One of them said, "Honey, flies don't care about chickens." Another one said, "If chickens could fix cows, Purina would have put feathers on a fly tag by now." That got the whole counter laughing. Rachel stood there with her hand on her wallet and let them have it. Tom shook his head and rang up the supplies. "I've been selling fly control in Polk County for 30 years, he said. "I've sold tags, sprays, dust bags, mineral additives, traps, back rubbers, pour-ons, and enough fly bait to cover half this county. But I'll tell you one thing I've never sold." He tapped the poultry netting. "Feathers as medicine." The men laughed again. Rachel did not argue. She did not explain the whole plan. She did not raise her voice. She paid the bill, lifted the netting under one arm, carried the chick starter with the other, and walked back out into the Missouri heat. Behind her, one of the men said, "Bill Turner's girl has been to college too long." Rachel heard him. She just kept walking. Because what Tom Bradley and the men at that counter did not understand was that Rachel was not trying to kill the flies already sitting on the cows. She was going after the flies that had not been born yet. And by the time the real fly season came on, that difference would make the whole county stop laughing. But before that happened, Rachel had to convince one man tougher than all the men at Bradley Livestock Supply put together. Her father. That summer came in wet and heavy. If you have never been in southern Missouri in June, imagine a morning that already feels tired before the sun is fully up. By 8 o'clock, the air had weight to it. By noon, the pastures steamed. Metal gates were hot to the touch. Creek bottoms stayed soft for days after a rain. Low ground held moisture. The grass looked thick and green from the road, but underneath that green was heat, rot, manure, and the perfect nursery for flies. Every cattleman in Polk County knew flies were part of summer. You expected some. You expected tails switching, heads tossing, a few black specks on the backs of cows standing near the shade. But that year was different. Face flies gathered around the eyes. Horn flies covered backs and shoulders like black pepper scattered over hide. Stable flies worked the legs until cattle stomped so hard the dirt under the shade trees turned bare. Calves that should have been nursing and grazing spent half the day shaking their heads. Cows that should have been spread out across pasture bunched up in corners, burning energy just trying to get relief. Bulls stood in the shade, stomping and switching, more bothered than breeding. Everybody had an answer. Fly tags, pour-ons, Sprays, dust bags, mineral additives, blue barrel traps behind barns, sticky ribbons hanging from rafters, feed-through products that promised control, reduction, suppression, and relief. For a while, some of it worked. Then the flies came back. At Bradley Livestock Supply, Tom Bradley could barely keep certain products on the shelf. Men came in complaining that the tags were not enough. The sprays were not lasting. The traps were full, but the cattle were still miserable. And Tom listened to all of them. He knew that county. He knew which farms ran black baldy cows, which ones ran Angus, which ones calved early, and which ones carried too many head on too few acres. He knew who paid cash, who ran a tab, who exaggerated, and who only complained when things were truly bad. By the second week of July, even the quiet men were complaining. That meant the flies were costing real money. Less grazing time, less weight gain, more stress, lower milk production, more treatment, more labor, more frustration. That was what everybody saw. Flies on cattle, flies in barns, flies around water tanks, flies near mineral feeders, flies on the backs of animals that could not get away from them. But Rachel Turner kept looking somewhere else. She looked down, at the manure pats scattered behind the herd, because to Rachel, every wet pile of manure in hot weather was not just waste, it was a factory. Turner Farm sat outside Bolivar, Missouri, on 300 acres that Rachel's grandfather had started with 40 acres, a borrowed tractor, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds a farm or breaks a man. Her father, Bill Turner, had taken over in the late 1990s. Bill was not flashy. He did not chase every new idea that showed up in a farm magazine. He did not like debt. He did not like waste. He fixed things before he replaced them. He trusted records, but he trusted them more when they were written in his own hand. He kept spiral notebooks in the kitchen drawer. He sharpened pocket knives on the porch. He believed a man ought to know when a cow was off feed before a vet had to tell him. Rachel was his oldest daughter. She had grown up opening gates, bottle-feeding calves, riding in the truck to the sale barn, and standing quietly beside her father at the co-op while men talked as if she was not listening. Then she went to the University of Missouri and studied animal science. When she came home, she still wore muddy boots. She still knew how to move cattle. She still knew which gate sagged and which waterer froze first. But she came back with one habit that made her father tired. She saw everything as a system. Pasture was a system. Cattle were a system. Water was a system. Soil was a system. Manure was a system. Even flies, she told him, were a system. Bill did not hate the word. He just did not trust people who used it too often. One evening in early May, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with 3 pages of notes, a folder, and a hand-drawn pasture map. Bill was eating eggs and toast. Her mother, Denise, was rinsing coffee cups at the sink. Rachel slid the papers in front of her father. "I want to put chickens behind the cattle," she said. Bill looked at the papers. Then he looked out the kitchen window toward the pasture. "We already have chickens," he said. Rachel shook her head. "Not those chickens." They had a small laying flock behind the house. 12 hens, 1 rooster with too much confidence, and a coop that leaned slightly left. Every farm seemed to end up with a flock like that sooner or later. But Rachel was talking about something else. She wanted a mobile chicken shelter on skids, light enough to pull with the ATV, large enough for 80 birds, strong enough to keep coyotes out at night, simple enough to repair with scrap lumber and tin from the old shed roof, and most important, she wanted to move it behind the cattle on a schedule. Bill set his fork down. "So," he said slowly, "you want to drag a chicken coop around my cow pasture?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, on purpose. Yes." Denise turned toward the sink so Bill would not see her smile. Bill looked back at the papers. "And this is supposed to fix the flies?" Rachel answered carefully. "Not fix. Reduce. Interrupt. It's not a magic trick." Bill stared at her. Rachel pointed to the pasture map. "The cattle graze a paddock first. Then we move them. 3 or 4 days later, the chickens go through that same paddock. They scratch through the manure, spread it out, eat larvae and insects, and leave manure of their own. It breaks the fly cycle before the next generation gets wings." Bill leaned back. "You learned this at school?" Some of it. Rachel hesitated. Then she said, "Grandpa kept chickens behind the milk cows when you were little." Bill looked up. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he said, "That was different." Rachel looked at him. Was it? That conversation did not end with a yes. Farm decisions rarely do. It ended with Bill saying, "I'll think about it," which in his language meant he had not decided to say no. But Bill Turner did think about it. He thought about it for a long time. Then one morning, Rachel found him in the machine shed with a tape measure in his hand, standing beside an old hay wagon frame. He watched her stretch the tape across the rusted steel. Then he said, "If we're doing this, we're building it right." Rachel tried not to smile too much. Bill saw it anyway. "Don't make me regret it," he said. By the end of May, the mobile coop was the ugliest thing on Turner Farm. They built it out of the old hay wagon frame, cattle panels, scrap lumber, tin roofing, hardware cloth, nest boxes, and 2 used tires from a neighbor who said he did not want them back. Bill welded the frame. Rachel cut wire. Denise painted the nest boxes. Rachel's younger brother, Caleb, held boards in place and complained every time a chicken got near him. The roof was patched with 3 different colors of tin. One side sat an inch higher than the other. The door stuck if you pulled it wrong. Rachel painted Turner Pasture Hens on the side in black letters. Caleb stood back and said, "Looks like a school bus for chickens." The name stuck. By the next week, half the county had heard about Bill Turner's chicken bus. A neighbor slowed his truck at the fence line and stared. At the feed store, Tom Bradley asked a cattleman, "You seen Bill Turner's latest equipment purchase?" The cattleman said, "You mean that chicken wagon?" Tom grinned. "I call it the feathered fly sprayer." The men laughed. The story spread from the feed store to the co-op, from the co-op to the sale barn, from the sale barn to the diner. By mid-June, Rachel had a nickname she had not asked for, Chicken Girl. Some people said it kindly, most did not. One man at the co-op said, "Bill Turner used to run a respectable cattle operation." Another said, "College doesn't teach flies." Tom Bradley said, "A notebook won't stop a horn fly." Rachel heard some of it. Bill heard more. At first, he tried to ignore it. Then one Saturday morning, at the fuel pump, a man asked Bill if the chickens were going to vaccinate the cows too. Bill did not laugh. He just said, "Ask me in August." But even Bill was not sure what August would prove, because Rachel's plan sounded foolish if you started with the adult fly. That was how most people thought about fly control. They saw flies on cattle, so they treated cattle. They saw flies in the barn, so they hung traps. They saw flies around the water tank, so they sprayed around the water tank. Rachel did not think those tools were useless. Turner Farm still used fly control products. She never pretended chickens would replace every tag, spray, trap, or management tool. But she also knew something that would not leave her alone. The flies on the cattle were only the part of the problem with wings. The next wave was sitting in the pasture. Rachel had a strange habit that summer. She looked at cow manure, not just a quick glance. She studied it. Once, Bill found her crouched beside a manure pat in the east pasture. He stood there a moment, then asked, "What are you doing?" Rachel did not look up. "Do you know how many fly eggs can be in fresh manure?" Bill Turner did not answer, but he did not walk away either. That day, Rachel started drawing the first simple diagram in her notebook. A cow drops manure. In warm, wet weather, flies find it quickly. They lay eggs. Those eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae feed and grow in the manure. Then they pupate. Then adult flies emerge. And by the time you are spraying the adults, another generation is already waiting under the next manure pat. Rachel wrote one sentence at the top of her notebook. Don't just fight the fly. Interrupt the cycle. Timing was everything. If the chickens followed the cows too soon, there would not be much for them to eat. If they followed too late, the flies would already be gone from the manure and back on the cattle. But if the chickens came through 3 or 4 days after the cattle, they arrived when the manure was full of life. But before that life turned into another cloud of flies, the chickens scratched open the manure pats. They spread them thin. They ate larvae, beetles, insects, and anything else they could find. The manure dried faster. The grass underneath got air. And the chickens added manure of their own. It was not clean. It was not easy. It was not magic. It was biology with feathers. Rachel moved the cattle first. Then she waited. Then she moved the chickens. Every morning, she checked water. Every evening, she locked the birds inside the mobile coop. She moved electric poultry netting. She counted birds. She checked for signs of coyotes. She carried feed. She pulled the chicken bus with the ATV, slow enough not to tip it, fast enough not to lose daylight. When it rained, the wheels sank. When it was hot, the smell got strong. When the chickens escaped, Caleb complained louder than the rooster. And every time Rachel thought about quitting, she remembered Tom Bradley laughing at the counter, not because she hated him, but because she knew the whole county was watching for her to be wrong. The first real test came after a week of hot rain, the kind of rain that does not cool anything down. It only wets the ground, fills the low spots, and turns the pasture into a greenhouse. By the second week of July, the fly pressure across Polk County jumped hard. At Bradley Livestock Supply, men came in angry. One said the spray barely lasted 2 days. Another said his calves were standing in the pond instead of grazing. A third said he had never seen stable flies that bad on the legs. Tom sold what he had. He gave advice. He listened. But he could not change the weather. On farms all around Bolivar, cattle bunched under trees. They stomped until the dirt turned bare. Calves rubbed their faces against fence posts. Cows switched their tails so much they looked exhausted. At Turner Farm, the flies were there too. Rachel never claimed they were gone. There were still flies around the cattle, still tails switching, still heads tossing, still irritation. But there was a difference. Small at first, then harder to ignore. The Turner cattle were still grazing late into the morning. The calves lay down in the shade instead of pacing non-stop. The cows spread out more often. The worst fly pressure seemed to show up in paddocks the chickens had missed or reached late. In the paddocks where the chickens followed on schedule, the manure pats looked different. They were scratched open, broken apart, drying faster, not sitting in thick, wet piles for days. Bill noticed before he admitted noticing. One evening, he stood at the fence with Rachel while the chickens worked through a paddock the cattle had left 4 days earlier. The birds scratched, clucked, and scattered manure across the grass. Bill watched one hen tear through a manure pat like she had found gold. After a long silence, he said, "They do like manure." Rachel said, "They like what's in it." Bill glanced at her. Then he looked back at the cattle. "I'm not saying you fixed it." Rachel nodded. "I didn't." Bill scratched his jaw. "But you changed it." Coming from Bill Turner, that was almost a speech. But Rachel knew better than to trust a good feeling. Feelings could fool a person. A calmer herd in one paddock might be weather. A bad fly day on a neighbor's farm might be timing. A good week might be luck. If she wanted her father to believe it, she needed records. If she wanted the county to stop laughing, she needed more than a story. So Rachel kept notes. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, she walked the herd and counted flies on selected animals. Not perfect counts, not lab-grade research, but consistent enough to matter. She wrote down which paddock the cattle had grazed, how long the manure had sat before the chickens came through, how many birds were in the coop, how much feed they ate, how many eggs they laid, how much spray the farm used compared with the same period the year before. She took photos of manure pats before and after the chickens worked them. She wrote down cattle behavior by hour, bunched under trees, grazing, standing in the pond, resting, stomping. By late July, patterns began to show. The paddocks, followed by chickens on the right schedule, had fewer wet manure pats lasting into the next week. The cattle spent more time grazing there. Fly counts were lower than in paddocks that missed the window. Spray use on Turner Farm was down. Egg sales at the end of the driveway helped cover some of the feed cost. Not all of it, but enough that Bill stopped calling the chickens expensive entertainment. Rachel still had problems. A wet week could throw off the schedule. A coop wheel bent near the creek bottom. 2 birds disappeared, probably to a fox. One afternoon, the electric netting shorted against wet grass, and 40 chickens escaped into the lane. Caleb chased them for half an hour and declared that no farm animal on earth was dumber than a chicken. Rachel wrote that down too. Labor, high. Predator risk, real. Weather problems, real. Effectiveness, strongest when timing is right. She did not want the system to look perfect. She wanted it to look true, because truth is stronger than a miracle, and those pages would later make a room full of cattlemen go quiet. But before that happened, the whole thing nearly failed. In early August, the rain came hard. 2 storms rolled through in 3 days. The creek rose. The low pasture near the sycamores turned soft. Rachel tried to move the chicken bus into a paddock that should have been ready, but one wheel sank nearly to the axle. The ATV spun. Mud slapped the side of the coop. The chickens inside made angry noises. Rachel stood there in the rain, staring at the chicken bus stuck in the mud. Water ran down her face. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb. Tom Bradley says, "What happens when the weather doesn't read her notebook?" Rachel stood there, soaked, holding the phone tight in her hand. She did not cry. But in that moment, she was scared. Scared they were right. Scared the whole summer had been a mistake. Scared she had cost her father time, money, and reputation on an idea that would end up being exactly as foolish as everyone said. Bill had to come down with the tractor and pull the coop free. For the first time all summer, he looked truly irritated. "You're going to tear this thing apart trying to follow a calendar," he said. Rachel wiped mud from her face. "I know. That paddock missed the timing window." 4 days later, the fly pressure there was worse. Not disaster worse, not proof that the idea had failed completely, but enough for Rachel to feel it in her stomach. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table. She did not complain. She did not make excuses. She opened her notebook and rewrote the system. No low-bottom paddocks within 24 hours of heavy rain. Add wider skids before next season. Prioritize higher ground during wet weeks. Use spray when weather breaks the chicken schedule. Do not pretend the system is stronger than the weather. Bill sat across from her, drinking coffee. After a long while, he said, "You quitting?" Rachel did not look up. "No." "You mad?" "Yes." "At Tom?" Rachel paused. "No." "At the part of him that was right." Bill smiled a little. "That's the part that teaches you." The next morning, Bill was in the machine shed before breakfast, cutting steel for a better skid. He never said he was proud. He just made the coop harder to sink. And 3 weeks later, at the county cattlemen's meeting, Rachel stood up in front of the same kind of men who had been laughing at her all summer. By the middle of August, fly season had become the main subject in Polk County. At the sale barn, men compared products. At the diner, they complained about cost. At Bradley Livestock Supply, Tom heard the same sentence 20 different ways. "They're still bad." Then the County Cattlemen's Association held its monthly meeting at the community center behind the Methodist Church. There were folding chairs, paper plates, a crock pot of beans, weak coffee, and 40 cattlemen who all looked tired of summer. Tom Bradley had a small table near the door with brochures, fly tags, and mineral information. Rachel came in carrying a folder. A few men noticed. One nudged another. There were whispers. Chicken Girl had arrived. Rachel sat near the back with Bill. She could feel eyes on the back of her neck. Halfway through the meeting, after a discussion about hay supply and a reminder about the fall vaccination clinic, the chairman asked if there was any new business. Rachel stood. Bill looked at her. "You sure?" he whispered. Rachel nodded. "I'd like 5 minutes," she said. The room turned. The chairman looked surprised, but he said, "Go ahead, Rachel." She walked to the front with her folder. She placed her notes on the table. Then she stood there in front of 40 men, many of whom had been farming longer than she had been alive. Men who had buried cows, pulled calves, paid notes, fixed fence in ice storms, and watched drought burn fields brown. She respected them. That was why her hand shook a little. For 3 seconds, she looked down at her notes. The room was quiet. Tom Bradley leaned back in his chair near the door, with his arms crossed. Rachel cleared her throat. "I'm not here to tell anybody to stop using fly control products," she began. "We still use them on our farm. I'm not here to tell you chickens are magic. They're not. They're loud. They're messy. And if you build your coop wrong, it will sink near a creek bottom and make you question every life choice that led you there." A few men laughed. This time, Rachel laughed with them. Some of the others glanced at each other. This was not quite the girl they thought they had been laughing at. Then Rachel said, "I'm here to talk about where flies come from." The room got quieter. Rachel opened the folder. She held up a photograph of a manure pat before the chickens had worked through it. Then she held up another one from after. "Most of us treat the flies we see," she said. "That makes sense. They're on the cattle. They're biting. They're costing money. But a lot of the next generation is coming out of manure before we ever see wings. She drew a simple line on the whiteboard. Egg, larva, pupa, adult. Then she marked the third and fourth day. This is the window I was trying to hit. Tom Bradley was no longer smiling. Rachel did not speak like a professor. That was why they listened. She did not use big words when small ones worked. She did not insult anyone for using sprays or tags. She did not act like she had invented farming. She just showed what she had seen. Cattle graze a paddock. Manure drops. Wait 3 to 4 days, depending on temperature and moisture. Move chickens in. Chickens scratch the manure open. Larvae and insects become feed. Manure dries faster. Cattle return later to cleaner pasture. Fly pressure does not disappear, but the cycle is interrupted. Then she showed them her notebook. Fly counts, paddock dates, spray use, egg sales, feed cost, weather notes, failures, repairs. A rancher in the second row raised his hand. How long after the cows? 3 to 4 days work best for us in hot weather, Rachel said. Longer if it cools down. Shorter if it's wet and warm. But if we waited too long, we lost the window. Another man asked, how many birds? We started with 80. I wouldn't tell everyone to start there. Start smaller if you're testing. Another asked, coyotes? Electric netting and locking them up at night. We still lost 2 birds. Another asked, how much labor? Rachel did not soften the answer. A lot, the room murmured. She nodded. If you want a zero labor solution, this is not it. But flies are not zero labor either. Tom Bradley stood near the door with his arms crossed. Then he asked the question everyone expected him to ask. What happens in a wet year when you can't move that coop? Rachel looked straight at him. The same thing that happens when rain washes spray off, she said. The system gets weaker. That's why I'm not calling this a replacement. I'm calling it a layer. No one laughed. Rachel turned back to the whiteboard. Then she said the sentence Bill would remember for years. We were fighting flies in the air while raising them on the ground. The room went still. The silence held. You could hear the ceiling fan turning overhead. An old cattleman in the third row, who had not said one word all evening, slowly nodded. Not because every man in that room had decided to buy chickens, not because Rachel had solved fly season forever, but because every cattleman there understood manure. Every cattleman there understood timing. Every cattleman there understood that a problem can look like one thing and start as another. For the first time all summer, the chicken bus did not sound like a joke. It sounded like a tool. After the meeting, men gathered around Rachel's folder. They asked about coop size. They asked about egg sales. They asked whether broilers would work or if laying hens were better. They asked if the chickens bothered calves. They asked if she still used fly tags. She answered everything she could. When she did not know, she said, I don't know yet. That probably helped more than pretending she did. Bill stood near the back of the room watching her. Denise had come too, though she stayed quiet near the coffee table. She looked at Bill once and smiled. Tom Bradley waited until the crowd thinned. Then he walked over. He picked up one of Rachel's printed sheets and studied it. You really kept all these records? He asked. Rachel nodded. Yes. Tom looked at the fly counts again. I still think it's a lot of work. It is, Rachel said. He looked toward the door, where 2 men were still talking about coop wheels. Then he said, but I guess flies are a lot of work too. Rachel did not smile too quickly. Tom folded the paper and handed it back. I laughed at you pretty good, he said. Rachel looked at him. You did. Tom nodded slowly. I shouldn't have done it in front of the counter. That was about as close to an apology as Tom Bradley usually came. Rachel accepted it for what it was. Then Tom pointed at the notes. You mind if I copy some of this? Not the whole thing, just enough to understand the timing. Rachel thought about it. Then she said, you can copy the timing, but write this part too. She pointed to a line in the notebook. Does not work without management. Tom read it and gave a short laugh. Not the mocking kind, the honest kind. Fair enough, he said. The next spring, the first person to build a small mobile chicken coop was not Rachel. It was Earl Jenkins, a 71-year-old cattleman who had called her chicken plan foolish the year before. Earl started with 25 birds. His coop was too heavy. The wheels were too small. The door opened the wrong direction. The first time he tried to move it, he nearly backed it into a ditch, but he kept at it. Then another family tried 40 birds behind a small herd. Then a young couple raising grass-fed beef asked Rachel to come look at their pasture map. Not everyone succeeded. One farmer quit after a month because he hated moving netting. Another lost birds to predators because he would not lock them up at night. A third waited too long after the cattle and decided the chickens did not help, until Rachel showed him he was arriving after the larvae had already moved on. The farms that treated it like a gimmick got gimmick results. The farms that treated it like timing, labor, and management saw something different. Not a miracle, not a fly-free paradise, but fewer wet manure pats sitting untouched, fewer hotspots, a little less spray, a little more grazing time, eggs to sell, pastures that looked more alive, and cattle that, on the worst days, did not seem quite as miserable as before. By summer, Bradley Livestock Supply still sold fly tags. It still sold sprays. It still sold traps and mineral additives. Tom Bradley did not become a chicken salesman. But something changed behind that counter. When a cattleman came in angry because the flies came back 3 days after spraying, Tom no longer reached for another jug right away. Sometimes he asked, "How tight are you rotating?" Sometimes he asked, "How long is manure sitting in those paddocks?" And once, when a young couple asked if there was anything they could do besides spraying more often, Tom reached under the counter and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. At the top was a simple diagram of cattle moving first and chickens following 3 or 4 days later. At the bottom, in Tom's handwriting, were 5 words. Timing matters. Ask Rachel Turner. A year later, on another May morning, a young man walked into Bradley Livestock Supply. He set a roll of electric poultry netting on the counter, a bag of chick starter, and 2 small wheels. Tom Bradley looked at the pile. Then he looked at the young man. "You fixing to run chickens behind cows?" Tom asked. The young man nodded, a little nervous. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. On it was the handwriting of a young woman most of the county had once laughed at. "Read this first," Tom said. "It'll save you from getting stuck in a mud hole." And out on Turner Farm, in the kitchen of a 300-acre place, built by her grandfather and held together by her father, Rachel Turner was adding another page to her notebook. This time, it was not just about flies. It was about something harder, teaching people what they are not ready to hear. By the end of that summer, the chicken bus was still ugly. The paint had faded. One corner of the roof rattled in the wind. The door still stuck if you pulled it wrong. The chickens still made a mess. The system still took work. But Bill Turner no longer called it Rachel's college project. One evening, a neighbor stopped by the fence and watched the hens scratching through a paddock the cattle had left behind. He looked at Bill and said, "You really think they help?" Bill rested his arms on the top wire. For a long time, he watched the chickens work. Then he said, "They seem to." Coming from Bill Turner, that was enough. Rachel stood farther down the fence line, pretending she had not heard. The cattle grazed in the next paddock, tails moving, but not wild. The calves lay in the shade. A few flies still circled their backs, because no farm gets rid of nature completely. But the pasture felt different. Not perfect, managed. That was the word Rachel liked better, managed. The chickens were not heroes. They were chickens. They scratched, clucked, escaped, laid eggs, spilled feed, and occasionally made Caleb threaten to move to town. But they had done what Rachel believed they could do. They had taken a problem everybody saw in the air and connected it back to the ground. They had turned manure from a fly nursery into feed, fertility, and proof. Most of all, they had reminded a county full of experienced men that sometimes a strange idea is only strange because nobody has bothered to look at it closely. They laughed at her chickens behind the cows. They laughed at the netting. They laughed at the chicken bus. They laughed at the girl with the notebook. Then fly season started. And by the end of that summer, Polk County was not just looking at flies on cattle anymore. They were looking at manure. They were looking at timing. They were looking at the ground. And nobody at Bradley Livestock Supply ever called it feathers as medicine again. Because the thing they laughed at had not replaced old wisdom. It had brought part of it back.